and for inviting me to this conference. It's particularly important to me because the reason I entered law in the first place was because I read Helena Kennedy's book. So this is quite the time for me. So as an overall summary of my piece, so women in the Southern Hemisphere are expected to face 70% of the impacts of climate change, with water, food access, safe waste disposal, and childcare already being impacted by the consequences of anthropogenic climate change. At the prevention and negotiation levels, women are inadequately represented and branded within instruments as victims rather than agents of change. The Council of Parties has offered a gender equitable alternative. My talk today will end with a discussion about the COP's gender program. So international environmental law movements may be grouped into three cycles. We have the conservationist cycle beginning in the late 19th century, the pollution prevention cycle starting in the mid-20th century and spanning the time of the environmental revolution, and the sustainable phase, development phase emerging in the 1980s and continuing into the 21st century. From its narrow beginnings with the German Ornithological Meeting of 1868 proposing an international treaty of bird conservation to necessary broadenings culminating in the Paris Climate Change Agreement of 2015, we see significant changes in legislative approaches, scientific understandings, and amidst the third cycle, the shift from mankind to humankind. The 1949 UN Scientific Conference on the Conservation and Utilization of Resources was the first time a UN body addressed depletion of resources, but purely from an economic perspective, rather than being conservation focused. Almost 2 decades later, the Economic and Social Council decided to include conservation in its agenda, and from this conversation stemmed the creation of the first UN Conference on the Human Environment. The Council was concerned with the consequent effects thereof of climate change on the conditions of man, his physical and mental well-being, his dignity, and his enjoyment of basic human rights in developing as well as developed countries. Also known as the First Earth Summit, the conference held to address the concerns of the Council took place in Stockholm in June of 1972. Here, a declaration of 26 principles and an action plan containing recommendations in 3 categories were published for global dissemination and utilization. Most notably, this summit raised climate change as an issue for the first time. The overall theme of the Stockholm Declaration was the pressing need to protect finite natural resources through conservation efforts, increased investment in renewable energy sources, and educating the younger generations about environmental matters. The conference was designed to inspire and guide the peoples of the world, men in particular, it seems. From the preambular paragraphs, we are told man is both creature and molder of his environment. Man has acquired the power to transform his environment, and both aspects of the man's environment, the natural and the man-made, are essential to his well-being and to the enjoyment of basic human rights. The declaration also refers to the human environment, gender-neutral terminology, but it appears as if women merely exist within the human environment. They are not actors qualified to lead the change, nor in possession of rights capable of being infringed upon by climate disaster. The one distinction the declaration does make between groups is between developing and developed states. The industrialized countries should make efforts to reduce the gap between them and the developing countries. Unquestionably a positive, as different states require different protection mechanisms, but inclusion only within the remit of developing countries and foregoing women in international environmental legislative materials continues to be a pattern throughout the 20th century. The First Earth Summit called for a convening of a second meeting on the environment, establishing the Governing Council of the United Nations Environment Programme, hereinafter UNEP, to be the body to lead the conversation and movement. Climate change did not become the focus of UNEP until 1979. Water resources, marine mammals, renewable energy resources, desertification, and forests took center stage. As climate destruction gained international traction, the Council decided to implement its first entirely climate change-focused instrument, the Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution of 1983. This multilateral treaty required the reduction of transboundary air pollution and investing in improving of air pollution intelligence. The collective efforts of states under the treaty have been remarkable, with lead pollution rates decreasing by over 80% between 1990 and 2019. Examining the convention through a gender lens, however, we face the same issues. Air pollution means the introduction by man of substances or energy into the air, resulting in deleterious effects. Of course, we must include the Montreal Protocol as one of the most successful multilateral environmental treaties in history. Its formation devised and led by UNEP, the protocol and its amendments focus was the phasing down and out of ozone-depleting substances across the globe. Unlike the convention prior, the Montreal Protocol is aware women are also capable of both having an adverse impact on the ozone layer and being a victim of the effects of ozone depletion. In 1988, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, a forum for the examination of greenhouse warming and global climate change, was created by the General Assembly, providing a dedicated UN body with a task of protecting the global climate through the devising of response strategies. The IPCC, together with the UNGA and UNEP, published Resolution 44207, Protection of Global Climate for Present and Future Generations of Mankind. Its only use of gender terminology is in its use of mankind, which, whilst perceived by some to be gender neutral, we know the variety of involved institutes are capable of gender-inclusive communication through their previous uses of human environment. Taking great inspiration from the Montreal Protocol, the IPCC, together with the wider UN, created the nearly universally ratified United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change of 1994, hereinafter UNFCCC. It further concretized the anthropogenic nature of climate change, with the ultimate objective being to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions and ensure the onus for change was placed upon developed countries. Textually, most references are to humankind, human activities, human health, and human environment, but makes one reference to the future generations of mankind, still a noticeable shift towards language inclusivity. We know the effects of climate change will overproportionally impact women, particularly in the Southern Hemisphere, but it was not until the Kyoto Protocol of 2005 that the use of man in a climate text was eliminated. The Kyoto Protocol operationalized the UNFCCC, providing states with individualized targets to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Throughout the prior legal instruments, women were underrepresented at the negotiation and creation levels. However, the delegations from Germany, Switzerland, Zimbabwe, Peru, and the Philippines during the Kyoto negotiations were brilliant women who forged links and mutual understandings amongst a classically male club. 21st century environmental movements finally saw women being represented both at the table and within the protective instruments. Including women in the climate change narrative was certainly a delayed process, considering the first international attempt at a women-specific convention, CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women of 1979. CEDAW's expansive contribution to the international human rights system includes the mainstreaming of a gender analysis, including positive obligations as a key part of human rights protection, and acting as a facilitator for domestic implementation efforts. The convention is not without its faults, its language tending to be sweeping and overbroad, and its focus on equality as a concept perhaps naive, as equality premised on equal treatment is difficult to achieve. As we now know, 1979 was also the year climate change became the focus of the UNEP, but formally connecting climate and gender would not occur until the introduction of the Nairobi Forward-Looking Strategies for the Advancement of Women of 1985. The strategies were designed to achieve and accelerate the economic and political emancipation of women at all levels. Developing and improving infrastructures to better support women is fundamental to the development of all societies. Based upon this notion, the strategy's climate policies include requiring rural women's access to land to be secured and ensuring women play a key role in science and technology research and development. Technological developments are vital in the fight to mitigate the effects of climate change, and without women, said advancements leave significant room for marginalization. On the 20th anniversary of the Stockholm Summit, the Rio UN Earth Summit of 1992 made it an objective within their agenda to implement the forward-looking strategies, particularly with regard to women's participation in national ecosystem management and control of environmental degradation. From this summit came the Rio Declaration, proclaiming that human beings are at the center of concerns for sustainable development, and yet a key element is missing: the social dimension. The social dimensions of climate change, including gender relations. Promises may be made to ensure women participate in environmental matters, but unless accessibility to such matters is examined through a gender lens, women's access, especially in poor nations, to land, credit, and information will continue to be less than men's in a gender inequitable market. This is especially so when solutions offered include compensation and carbon trading systems, as commoditizing carbon is a system biased towards those already possessing market access. The Beijing Platform for Action, hereinafter BPFA, an outcome of the Fourth World Conference on Women and Girls, on Women in 1995, was a particularly momentous occasion because women and girls were not an afterthought. They were the very center of the discussion. It broke away from the pattern of the broad usage of humankind in all societies,
finally recognizing that leaving out a gender distinction within climate discourse was not the inclusivity it set out to be. Quite simply, gender distinction is required when climate change's impacts are distinct by gender. The fourth conference's position regarding women in climate rang loud and clear. Women have an essential role to play. Through the management and use of natural resources, women provide sustenance to their families and communities, and yet remain largely absent at all levels of policy formulation and decision-making. To help remedy this, the BPFA created 3 objectives for governments, NGOs, and international organizations. 1, women must be actively included in environmental decision-making at all levels. 2, gender concerns and perspectives are to be integrated into all sustainable development programs. And 3, assessment mechanisms of environmental policies need to be either established or strengthened at all levels. This is best done through gender mainstreaming, improving both equitable access and facilitating a form of participation that enables women as well as men to influence the entire agenda and priorities of the organization. Recommending gender mainstreaming within gender spaces that discuss climate destruction whilst beneficial was hardly revolutionary. It was not until the UN Climate Change Conference of 2007 in Bali that finally gender was centered in a climate space. The Bali conference was something of a breakthrough for gender advocates. A UN FCCC first, a gender-specific civil society network of women was created, Gender CC, Women for Climate Justice. The formation of the Global Gender and Climate Alliance quickly followed, launched by several UN bodies during the conference. Even the UN FCCC Secretariat accepted the need for gender mainstreaming as a necessity for any future climate agreement. The specific gender mainstreaming approach to be utilized, however, was not agreed upon, resulting in a conflict between 2 modern major gender and climate instruments, the COP's Lima Programme and CEDAW Committee recommendations. For some context, the UN Conference of the Parties, COP, operates under the UN FCCC as its supreme decision-making body. Yearly meetings are convened with all state parties to the convention represented. COP20 took place in Lima, Peru in 2014 and is of particular note because here the Lima Work Programme on Gender was created. The Lima Programme is a 2-year work programme designed to advance gender-responsive climate policies, including a mapping of all relevant decisions on gender and climate change. COP23 later published a gender action plan under the Lima Programme designed to advance women's full, equal, and meaningful participation and promote gender-responsive climate policy and the mainstreaming of a gender perspective in the implementation of the convention. These programs brand women as powerful agents of change in the environmental sphere. Women are vulnerable to the impacts of climate disaster, but that does not mean assigning passive victimhood to an entire gender. Victim and vulnerable descriptors are consistently used to disempower women, to frame women as anything but active political subjects. This is not to say that scholarship noting the greater vulnerability of women to environmental damage is not important. After all, the majority of the globe's farmers are women, and food production already faces significant devastation, but it should not be the only lens which we look through. The Lima Programme does not make reference to women as victims once. It acknowledges the need for gender-responsive climate policies under all activities within the UN FCCC, requires increased efforts to be made to improve participation of women at all levels of delegation, and encourages the building upon of skills and capacity of said delegates to ensure effective participation. The UN has previously blamed its absence of women in critical climate roles upon a lack of women and gender experts in climate-related negotiations, so this last element is exceptionally crucial. The only mention of vulnerability is in regards to developing countries and small islands and their increased susceptibility to the impacts of anthropogenic climate change. The CEDAW Committee takes a different stance. To date, the committee has put forward 39 general recommendations. Recommendation 37, published in 2018, focuses upon gender-related dimensions of disaster risk reduction in the context of climate change. It points out that gender mainstreaming will reinforce the resilience of individuals and communities globally in the context of climate change and disasters. It calls upon the UN FCCC to take action on climate change on the basis of equity and in accordance with common but differentiated responsibilities and capabilities. GR13 acknowledges the requirement for distinctions and re-acknowledges the 2015 Paris Agreement preamble, which calls upon states to enhance gender equality and the empowerment of women amidst human rights obligations. GR37 also points out the higher vulnerability and exposure of women and girls, yet fails to address the barriers faced by women in gaining access to disaster risk reduction frameworks. Gender-responsive risk reduction initiatives, as highlighted by the Lima Programme, are known to address these barriers and actively lead to increased gender parity and empowerment. GR 37's understanding of gender is also troubling. It appears based upon a notion in which men are assumed to be the norm from which women differ, placing the onus upon women and girls to increase their awareness and chances of participation. This recommendation also furthers the victim narrative that pervades gender and climate discussions. Whilst in paragraph 7, the branding of women and girls as passive, vulnerable groups in need of protection, it fails to commit to this ideal throughout the document. It assumes women's universal vulnerability, makes general claims about women's disadvantages using only anecdotal data, and restricts gender-based violence to women and girls. Once again, women are forced into the category of victim, associated with tragedy, powerlessness, and helplessness. Its absence of intersectionality, especially given Black women's inextricable experiences of racism and sexism, limits the effectiveness of any future climate regulations. Whilst the Lima program has room for improvement regarding intersectionality, COP is not a gender-focused body, CEDAW is. It should be expected that the committee has a multi-axis approach to gender discrimination. Moving forward, the CEDAW committee should invest in intersectional and interdisciplinary approaches towards its climate policies to prevent categorization of women as one vulnerable entity. All future climate disaster risk reduction frameworks need to utilize the empowering approach of the Lima program, together with the inadequately used expertise of the CEDAW committee, to ensure we do not repeat the failures of the UN's past. The Paris Climate Change Agreement already shows strong promise with both preambular and article dedication to gender equity and gender responsive approaches, but we are yet to see their interpretation of what it means to be vulnerable. COP27 will surely give us a conclusive answer as gender continues to feature heavily in international climate discussions. Thank you so much for everyone for listening.
Thank you, Freya, for that swift gallop through about 70 years of history.
I tried to keep it in 15 minutes.
No, there's a lot to think about there. I was struck by things like, the 1972 conference has to completely overlook Rachel Carson's book, which is already a decade old by then. And you're describing this dance of leaving things out and then bringing them back in again. The 1985, we first think of gender and climate. 1995, we have the Beijing, the wonderful Beijing platform, but there's no connection there between militarism and environmentalism. And that actually really is only starting to emerge now into the women, peace and security space, which is one of the things we're exploring in this conference. So yes, we are constantly dogged by these exclusions and these ignoring each other's narratives. And very, very good point made about CEDAW and its absolute regressive language. Usually unusual for CEDAW actually, because they usually exercise quite a lot of leadership. Yeah, but I think your paper set us up so nicely to listen to what Aya is going to say about those linkages between climate and gender and militarism. So Aya, I'm going to hand over to you now. Thank you, Freya, for that lovely paper. And a great start to the conference. Aya, are you there? Are you ready?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, everyone. I'm glad to be here. I'm going to talk about climate change and the gender vulnerabilities and looking at the linkages that are often not addressed. We know that there are real obligations that women, have real needs that are not met, needs and perspectives that are not usually often spoken about. Climate change adds to women's sufferings in a way that is different from men. It adds to their poverty because of the combination of so many factors that we know, like patriarchy, like norms, gender norms, poverty, environmental degradation caused by climate change. Even though there have been a lot of talk about women issues, often we don't link them in a way that actually speaks to other areas that women suffer a lot from.